Okay, I have 7 o'clock. I'm going to go ahead and go live. Good evening. My name is Susan Waterman, and I am the chair of the Windsor County Democratic Committee. It's my honor to welcome you this evening to the Windsor County Democratic Committee's 2022 Attorney General Candidate Forum. This evening, candidates Charity Clark and Rory Thibault will share with us their vision for the Vermont Attorney General's office. The questions to be asked this evening were submitted by residents of Windsor County. Thank you to each person who took the time to submit their questions. And we will also be selecting some questions from the YouTube live stream chat, so get your questions ready. These questions have not been supplied to the candidates or their staff ahead of time, so they'll be hearing them along with you in real time. Facilitating along with me this evening is Dottie Deans, who will be keeping track of each speaker's time to ensure that each candidate's opportunity for communication remains equitable. Please take a moment at the conclusion of this evening's forum to visit the link down below the video to make a donation to the Windsor County Committee. Your donations will help us to continue to do the important work we're doing in Windsor County. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to make an introduction for themselves, and then we'll dive into the questions. So I randomly selected the order for this evening. So we're going to be starting with Rory. Please take a couple of minutes to tell us about yourself.
Well, good evening, and thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be joining Windsor County Democrats, and I greatly appreciate you taking the time and opportunity to host a forum rather than just a Zoom session to meet members. So I'm joining you tonight from Cabot, where I live with my wife, Joanna, and my sons, River and Cody. We moved back to Vermont in 2016, but our family adventure in Vermont began when I met Joanna at law school, in Vermont Law School, right in South Royalton. It was really our love for Vermont that drew us back here. After 8.5 years of active duty military service, we decided it was time to settle down and plant some deep roots. And we've done that here in Cabot. Like many Vermonters, I have a lot of different hats to wear. Some of you may know me as the Washington County State's Attorney, but I have a lot more going on than that. Here in Cabot, I'm chair of the school board. I'm also a youth soccer coach, a sometimes farmer, and also a friend and neighbor who is involved in the community, like so many others. My growing up and my experiences before getting to Vermont Law School has really shaped my worldview. I grew up in a blue-collar union household. I know the value of hard work and how important it is for working families to thrive. I attended college on an Army ROTC scholarship, and as I already indicated, that set me on the path of active duty service. And really, my whole life experience has been centered around public service. I value the opportunities that I have because of strong government, because of good education, and ultimately of having the space to grow up and be myself as a kid. As your next Attorney General, I want to take those life experiences and my experience as Washington County's Chief Law Enforcement Officer to Montpelier and the Pavilion Building. We need to focus on a 21st century criminal justice system, defend our fundamental rights and our democracy against right-wing extremism from the courts, and also make sure that we are achieving our climate goals, achieving climate justice, and ultimately the most important role of the Attorney General is that of being the state's chief and law enforcement officer and focusing on public safety. I vow to give my every ounce of energy to making sure Vermont remains a safe, vibrant place for all.
Thank you very much, Rory. Next, we'll be moving on to Charity. Charity, if you can take a few moments to tell us about yourself.
Well, first, thanks so much for hosting or having us tonight. It's really great to be in Windsor County. I was born in Windsor County and lived in Windsor County the first 8 years of my life. I grew up working in my family's grocery store, Clark's IGA. Maybe some of you have shopped there. And I started my first day when I was 10 and worked my last day when I was in law school. I stocked shelves, I ran the cash register. And during that time, I saw all kinds of people. I saw people thriving. I saw people struggling. I saw people grabbing a grinder on their way to work or, juggling their kids. And when I grew up and became a lawyer, I took those experiences with me, especially these last 8 years working in the Attorney General's office. For the last 4 years, I have served as chief of staff. And in that role, I was a member of the leadership team. I was a part of decisions the office made on every major issue we faced. whether it be environmental, consumer, or criminal. I always try to lead, keeping in mind that everyday Vermonter I encountered so many times growing up working in my family's store. I believe that our communities need an attorney general who has the understanding of the breadth and scope of the office. I want to tell you my priorities when I get started in January, and it's first, gotta protect consumers, protect small businesses. 2, public safety is a priority. It is paramount, but we also need necessary criminal justice reform so that our criminal justice system reflects the values we have here in Vermont. I think we're currently a little out of alignment and there's work to be done. 3, we need to make sure that the Vermont Climate Action Plan is implemented so that we can meet the targets of the Global Warming Solutions Act. This is the existential crisis of our time. 4, we've never elected a woman attorney general, and I will place renewed focus on the issues of violence against women, including reproductive rights, domestic violence, and sexual violence. I look forward to talking with you tonight, and thanks again for having me.
Thank you, Charity. So both of you mentioned obviously the chief law enforcement as being one of the important aspects of the job of Attorney General. So our first question is going to be about that in criminal justice. Just to give you a heads up, Rory, you're first on this question. As chief law enforcement for the state of Vermont, what is your stance on limiting law enforcement access to technology such as facial recognition software, automated license plate readers, and warrantless access to personal data through third-party sources?
Well, that's a complex question, and it's really the intersection of 2 values that Vermonters place on a pedestal. First, which is our privacy, especially our digital footprint, and also remaining safe in the community. I think where the rubber meets the road for this is really when we start talking about gun violence and school safety. And that's at the paramount where I think most Vermonters have a lot of concern about keeping people safe. At the same time, there is a need for strengthened digital privacy in Vermont. This question doesn't directly pertain to reproductive liberties, but I think Vermont legislature, when it comes back into session, needs to immediately act to enhance protections to ensure that third-party providers can never disclose protected health information or searches that users are looking into. That said, the greatest gatekeeper we have in Vermont is the strength of our judiciary. Judicial review is already an integral part of how and when we apply for search warrants, and the bypassing of legal process should not be tolerated. The use of license plate readers and other information gathering should also be subject to periodic either review or judicial oversight. An outright ban could inhibit our, I think, fairly desperate fight against the flow of fentanyl into the state of Vermont and guns out of the state of Vermont. Moreover, my concern is if the state were to preclude this, it would not limit our federal partners from continuing to do so. Ultimately, we need to make sure that these systems and processes, when used, have the appropriate oversight, have judicial intervention to ensure that there are limits and both scope and time of the information collected, and ultimately where it's used. I think one thing Vermont can pat itself on the back on is being a leader in terms of adopting our Electronic Communications Act. Already there's a limit when a subpoena or search warrant goes out to a provider. Any information that's not relevant or goes beyond the scope of that search must be destroyed. And if anyone intends to use it, there needs to be reapplication back to a Superior Court judge to enable its use. Ultimately, it's up to prosecutors, judicial oversight, and those in joint justice oversight to make sure that whatever regime we adopt in Vermont, that it is one that puts public safety first, but also respects our rights as Vermonters and our privacy interests.
Thank you, Rory. Charity, would you like for me to repeat the question?
Sure, that would be helpful.
As chief law enforcement for the state of Vermont, what is your stance on limiting law enforcement access to technology such as facial recognition software, automated license plate readers, and warrantless access to personal data through third-party sources?
I believe that a value we have here in Vermont is privacy. It's something that we expect. It's something that we have honored. There is certainly a tension when we are talking about technology and public safety. One of the areas that I worked on a lot as chief of staff these past 4 years is data privacy. For the past 4 years, I have worked in the legislature with stakeholders and with our Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force to come up with a way forward that we can use this technology in a way that honors the privacy we all expect in Vermont while making sure that we keep the public safe. So right now in January, based on work that we have done in the Attorney General's office for the past 2 years, the legislature will be taking up a privacy bill that addresses the issue of biometric information, and that's facial recognition would include that. It's really, really important that we acknowledge the breadth and scope of the ability of that technology. The state of Vermont is currently in litigation against a facial recognition software company that has screen scraped the internet for photographs of people and compiled them, identified them, and private companies can purchase this database. It's pretty disturbing that you could be sitting on a bench in White River Junction and find yourself without realizing it in this database. We have a lot of work to do in the legislature on this issue. And I would echo the opportunity we have to craft legislation that addresses the issue of geolocation data and making sure that individuals who are seeking help from Vermont with an abortion have their privacy protected as well.
Thank you very much. That kind of leads into our next question. Both of you mentioned reproductive rights. So for this question, we are going to be starting with Charity, just a heads up. That, sorry, I lost track of where my questions are. If an attorney general from a state where abortion was illegal contacted you to obtain information regarding a resident who they alleged traveled to Vermont for abortion medical services, would you comply for their request for information?
No, I would not. 3 weeks ago, a couple of days after the Dobbs decision came out, I had a press conference with legislators to outline my plan for making Vermont a safe harbor for those affected by the Dobbs decision. I think that Vermont overwhelmingly believes in bodily autonomy. They believe in personal freedoms. And I think, those of us who were personally impacted by the Dobbs decision were deeply disturbed, appalled that our rights were being stripped away. As Attorney General, I will do everything in my power to protect Vermonters and all those affected by the Dobbs decision. That includes not cooperating with out-of-state investigations related to abortions that otherwise would be legal in Vermont. That includes, again, data privacy and making sure that we are protecting the geolocation data. And in addition, the Consumer Protection Act right now allows us to bring action against deception in the marketplace, which would include those outfits that are deceiving abortion seekers and delaying their ability to obtain an abortion, or sending pills that are not actually medicine and that kind of thing. Right now, we have a statute in place that would protect that. We have an ability to create an easy listserv or an easy list of pharmacies in Vermont that are registered and legitimate, so that folks out of state know that they can get, they can rely on the medicine they're getting from those pharmacies. I will just close by saying, I was personally affected by this decision. I'm a mom, I'm a woman. I will be fighting as hard as possible to protect Vermont, to protect Vermont's practitioners who might be performing abortions and providing abortion treatment out of state, and of course, Vermonters.
Thank you, Charity. Rory, would you like for me to repeat the question?
No, that's okay. I just want to start by saying, I really agree with Charity, but I think there's more that we can do. And I think we have a framework of how the state of Vermont can go about not cooperating with hostile outside actors. We already do this in terms of our fair and impartial policing policy when it comes to those in Vermont who are either undocumented or the subject of civil federal immigration enforcement. We have I think, established precedent of not allowing for state resources to be used for things that are contrary to our values. I think that Proposition 5 sets up, one, by enshrining reproductive liberties as a constitutional right, a very solid legal basis for us to refuse to cooperate with other states that would seek to violate the rights of our citizens or people who are in our state and subject to our jurisdiction. So I think fundamentally we need to protect those who come from Vermont. Our protection can't just be for those who are seeking abortion access. It is highly likely that at some point in time, we will have providers who are going to seek refuge in the state of Vermont. We need to make sure we're taking care of them, just as much as we need to make sure that we're looking into the legal mechanisms of how we can take care of Vermont women or those with a uterus who are outside the state of Vermont when they need reproductive health access or need abortion access. That involves working with insurers. It involves being creative and making sure that we can get Vermonters to a place where they are safe, where they could be serviced. As Charity indicated, I also agree. We need to reinforce our data privacy protections, but I think we need to go beyond just talking about that and actually present a plan to the legislature so that it's very clear what the legal limits are, what we can do under our Constitution, and moreover, how we can best ensure that all protected health information is not does not make way into the public domain and cannot be used against Vermonters who are seeking to exercise their liberties. Thank you.
Thank you, Rory. As a follow-up to both of you, in the YouTube chat, we had a question. So I don't use a full 2 minutes, just a simple answer for this. We'll start with Charity. What is the constitutional status of the women's equivalent of the Fugitive Slave Act in current jurisprudence?
I don't know. I have not done that legal research. I'm sorry that I can't answer that question.
Okay. Rory, do you have any thoughts on that?
Vermont, like all states, is party to the Uniform Extradition Act, which provides the framework under which we extradite individuals. It's something that we work with. However, there are limits and there are some means by which Vermont can protect women or those with a uterus who are seeking refuge here.
Okay. All right, so the next question, again, we're going to start with Charity, just so you know that you're going to be first up on this one. There have been very few opinions issued by the Attorney General's office in recent years. Actually, only one in the last 10. This is far fewer than most state Attorney General offices. Why do you think this is? And do you think that it indicates a lack of influence by the Attorney General's office within the state government?
I believe passionately that the Attorney General's office plays a really important role, not just in state government and the executive branch, but also in the legislature. And we are very active. For starters, there are 150 people working in the Attorney General's office across 7 divisions. And those are, involve 90 attorneys. And many of those attorneys are have client agencies. So, the Agency of Transportation, the Agency of Agriculture, and so on. They have a lot of influence and provide legal counsel and advice to those agencies. And in addition to that, we are regularly in the legislature. As chief of staff for 4 years, I oversaw our legislative work and myself was in the legislature frequently. It's really important that we are involved in government and we are a partner. One of the visions I have for the Attorney General's office when I'm Attorney General is to be that robust partner so that when we are needed across state government, we will show up, we will be helpful, we will provide our expertise. Because keep in mind, the legislature, they have their own legislative counsel. Many state agencies also have in-house counsel and general counsel, but the Attorney General's office has particularized expertise in several areas. And we need to always be ready to put up our hand and show up to be helpful. As to the specific question about Attorney General's office's opinions, I've worked there for 8 years. They are few and far between. Usually the work can get done by what I've just described. And occasionally we do need an opinion. It is very useful. So we provide those from time to time. But generally, we are trying really hard to show up and be that active partner that I believe we will be again in January when I return.
Thank you, Charity. Rory, same question to you. Would you like for me to repeat it?
Yes, please.
There have been very few opinions issued by the Attorney General's office in recent years. In fact, only one in the last 10. This is far fewer than most state Attorney General offices. Why do you think this is? And do you think that it indicates a lack of influence by the Attorney General's office in state government?
I don't think it's so much a lack of influence as it is either a lack of confidence or a lack of transparency. The Attorney General needs to be a leader and not be afraid to put out the office's position on really complicated issues. We shouldn't be afraid, or the lawyer shouldn't be afraid to stand on their opinions and let the public review them, let people assess them, and let people challenge them. The Attorney General's office is a place that is constantly in controversy or turmoil. But things don't get better by hiding behind privilege or hiding behind, memo can't be released. I look, for example, at officer-involved shootings. I've reviewed 4 in my career as Washington County State's Attorney. Each and every opinion I've generated and memorandum I sent back to law enforcement has detailed not only the legal standard, the facts, and then the reasoning for my decision for what to do with the case and recommendations to law enforcement. The Attorney General's office has declined to do that. We get a cursory press opinion and sometimes a brief. That's not being transparent with Vermonters. And we talk often about, in the local level at town meeting day, having open meeting law and not being afraid to express what our opinions are. So ultimately, to loop back around, the issue is not a lack of influence. It's a lack of will and desire to be transparent with Vermonters. And that's one of the first things I want to change as your next Attorney General.
Thank you, Rory. And the next question, we're going to start with you. So, and this kind of actually is led into by your response on that last question in regard to Brady letters. So please describe what your policy would be as Attorney General regarding Brady letters. Specifically, would you encourage, require, put into place a policy for the county state's attorneys to have a protocol?
So first, I'm really proud that I am right now the only state's attorney or prosecutorial agency, including the Attorney General, that has an actual policy dealing with this. Part of the success in my office in dealing with officer misconduct is really, I think, around having clarity, both for officers and for the public about what we do and what our obligations are. It also allows my deputies and others to make sure that they are assessing cases and looking through a lens of transparency and accountability every time we're prosecuting or bringing someone into court. The benefit of the Attorney General's office is statewide jurisdiction. When the Attorney General decides to set a policy or a standard, that is a statewide standard, because at any point in time, any law enforcement case can end up being an Attorney General case. So I think by setting a floor, perhaps not a ceiling, but at least by setting a floor and a standard policy, we would be serving Vermonters well, without legislative action and without the need for longer deliberation. The standard is clear in the law. Our ethical obligations as prosecutors are clear in the law. It is one of those simple things that everyone should have done. And I'm surprised that the Attorney General declined the opportunity in the past few years to join on a policy that was already written or to come up with their own standard, especially in light of some of our efforts on law enforcement reform not making it through the State House. So ultimately, this is an area in which I think I can provide real leadership for Vermonters and ensure that our accountability mechanisms are robust, transparent, and consistent.
Thank you, Rory. Same question to you, Charity. Would you like for me to repeat it?
Sure.
Please describe what your policy would be as Attorney General regarding Brady letters. Specifically, would you encourage, require, put into place a policy for the county state's attorneys to have a protocol?
I want to begin by saying I think that we are at a moment in history when we are looking at ways that we can make changes to our police system. And it's a good thing. It's happening in Vermont. It's happening nationally. I really believe in that work, and I'm totally supportive of that work. It's really important that we assess and make sure that we're doing the best we can so that all people who live in Vermont feel safe. All people who live here and visit here deserve to feel safe. Regarding Brady letters, last year I participated in conversations with legislators working on a bill to be introduced this past January, which it was. And that bill went through the legislative process. And ultimately, there's a working group going on this summer to look at how a statewide registry and policy might look here in Vermont. What would be the best fit here? We were supportive of that work and of that bill. I personally was supportive of that bill. And I think it's important with all big public policy decisions that we hear all the voices and that we get it right. So I am looking forward to January when we have input from that working group, and looking forward to supporting a bill in January so that we can make sure we get it right for Vermont.
All right, thank you. This next question comes from the YouTube chat, and we're going to be starting with Rory again. Scam calls continue to plague Vermonters. What will you do to address this issue?
We've been desperately trying to reach you about your auto's extended warranty. I've had that one a few times in the last week, and the perils of running a political campaign is you never know who's calling. And so if it's an 802 number, I'm inclined to pick up. I think it's incredibly frustrating for Vermonters. We live by our digital devices, and especially in a time period where so many of us are working remotely or having to use alternate workspaces. It's unfortunate when our phones are tied up or when we're inconvenienced by spam texts or by robocalls. Enforcing this is difficult, but I think the best way to do it is to ensure that we build capacity in law enforcement and in our investigative agencies to make sure we can actually track down who is behind them. The answer can't simply be that it's some foreign national or a company overseas. We need to make sure that we're working hand in hand with telecommunications providers. And when those companies do line up and are a US entity, making sure that we are coordinating with other states or using our own legal process to hold them accountable, whether it's through an injunction, a cease and desist letter, or eventually, if it gets bad enough, perhaps a criminal charge. I will say this, I think that the Attorney General's office has a solid track record. Both the Consumer Assistance Program and the office itself, its civil division, among others, have done a good job of looking at how to mitigate and push back against scammers and also unwanted telecommunication activity, mainly robocalls or the scam and spam texts. That's work that needs to continue. And I'll credit, Charity has been a leader and advocate for this. And I am happy to say that among the departments in the Attorney General's office, the Consumer Assistance Program is one of those shining lights that really stands out. Now, that being said, I think that one way we can reinforce the consumer program is by making sure the Attorney General's office has a client assistance program. Right now, there's only one victim advocate in the criminal division. We need to do better making sure that people who are impacted are kept up to date about what's happening and don't just send a complaint into the abyss with no action.
All right, thank you. Charity, same question to you. Scam calls are a major problem for a lot of us. So what would you do to address this issue?
First, just let me say that, scam calls for some are just a nuisance. For others, they can not only result in you losing money, but also in anxiety and distress. They, for some, can be constant. So this really is a huge problem. The Consumer Assistance Program receives 5,000 scam reports every year and makes contact with 15,000 consumers every year. Contrary to Rory's description, actually what the Consumer Assistance Program does is it runs a letter mediation service. So it already has that person who is facilitating with the consumer and the business who is being complained of. And that service is very effective. And if anyone watching this has a concern, you can call them at 1-800-649-2424. They do great work. Let me talk about scams. The most effective way to reduce scams is education. And that is because most of the scams originate overseas. It's very, very difficult to shut down a scam. So education is incredibly important. One of the things that I'm going to do in January is use social media and other technology to reach new pockets of folks who need to get educated. We have a scam alert system. We go out and talk to communities about scams to warn them, and it's really, really helpful. But I think social media has opportunities that we can continue to push and make sure that we're reaching people with content so that they can be educated about scams. The other thing that is so important, there is something we can do, and we're doing. I supervised this work when I was chief of staff. Robocalls come into our country from out of the country, and there is a telephone operator who is the facilitator of that robocall. And we can perform a traceback to see how short a call is and how many are being facilitated and identified as a robocall. And when we do, we can pursue action, a violation of the Consumer Protection Act against that person. We've been successful. I supervise the lawyer doing that work. And in January, I'm going to get back at it. And I'm looking forward to protecting Vermont consumers.
Thank you. Okay, for the next question, we are going to start with Charity. You're going to be up first for this one. What is your opinion regarding addressing hate speech and misinformation on the internet?
This is a big problem for all of us, but I especially worry about children. And we know that social media has increased risks for suicide for teenagers. It's really, really concerning. Now, that isn't necessarily hate speech and like a hate crime hate speech, but I just wanted to address the issue of social media, I think is incredibly problematic. I also want to address specifically in the context of using hate speech with regard to public officials, because we have seen in Vermont hate speech used to intimidate and harass public officials. It's totally unacceptable. We all need to be concerned about this. And the reason why is because when that speech is used to have a chilling effect on people, especially people of marginalized communities, from participating in government or in civic life, it is incredibly problematic. It is a burden on the democratic freedoms and the ideals we have here in Vermont. We all need to be concerned and doing what we can. What I want to do in January when I'm Attorney General is host a convening in the Attorney General's office of various stakeholders and experts so that we can see what we can do to address this issue once and for all and just move the needle on making sure that we're doing what we can. One of the challenges that we have had in the past and will continue to have is the wonder of free speech. The free speech that protects the speech I like also protects the speech I don't like. And that's something that we have to live with, but it's also something that we need to work with and work around so that we can protect people and make sure that there isn't this chilling effect on participation in civic life and in town and state government.
Thank you, Charity. Same question to you, Rory.
So I'm going to disagree with a little bit of what Charity said. And having another working group or another meeting isn't the solution to dealing with hate speech. You need to take action. I was really proud in the last legislative session to partner with the Senate Judiciary Committee and also Senator Clarkson, who was the sponsor of the bill, to take a look at our criminal threatening statute and how it was not working and not serving Vermonters. The legislature removed an affirmative defense to that bill, which was effectively making it unchargeable and unusable. And likewise, added enhancements for both state government employees and elected officials and election officials at the local level. We need to make sure those people have the opportunity to do their jobs and uphold the rule of law without being threatened or harassed online by hate speech. Also put on my school board chair hat for a moment. A lot of bad things happen when kids are on the internet unsupervised. I think one area in which we as a state have failed and need to take immediate action is giving our hazing, harassment, and bullying laws applied to schools and in our education statutes some real meaning and effect. A lot of school administrators and educators feel powerless right now to respond in a meaningful way to harassment or bullying that's going on in the cyber environment, not necessarily on the playground or in the classroom, but after hours. This impacts students' availability for learning, and it impacts how families feel and how welcome they are in the community. We have the tools, we have resources, and we have laws that fall under the constitutional umbrella where we're not hitting at protected speech, but there has to be a will and desire of law enforcement, of school officials, and ultimately of prosecutors and civil rights attorneys at the Attorney General's office to stand up and use those tools and not just take the cases that we know we can win, but be bold enough to stand up and do what is right for people who are of color or those who are different, whether part of the LGBTQIA community or Americans who are new to this country. We need to be doing more, and the tools are there. We just need to have the people who want to use them in the right positions.
Thank you, Rory. This next question is another big one. Just a heads up, Rory, you're going to be first on this one. So the U.S. Supreme Court will be hearing the case Moore versus Harper next session. There is concern that this ruling could have broad implications for the 2024 election if the court rules broadly enough that states can set their own laws regarding the selection of presidential electors. What are your thoughts on this, and how could the Attorney General's office coordinate with other Attorney General offices to make a difference if this happens? If either one of you want me to talk more about the case, I pulled up some background on it, and I can.
So I have to confess, I have not yet read any of the briefs or where the background and procedural posture, but I am familiar with this from one of the SCOTUS blog updates of what's coming in general terms. I'll just start with this. It is absolutely terrifying to see what right-wing extremism is doing to the core of our nation's democracy. Election security should be one of those things we don't have to worry about. And yet, in the last 10 years, we've watched the federal judiciary slowly roll back the Voting Rights Act. And now we're coming down to the point of just outright stealing elections. I can't fathom how this is tolerated in other states, but I think it's critical that states like Vermont that respect and believe in upholding the rule of law fight together, whether it's California, New York, Massachusetts, whatever coalition of the willing, we need to work cooperatively and collaboratively. Our Attorney General's office does have a good history of providing sometimes leadership, but often following in the wake of other litigation or joining in where possible. I think one thing that Vermonters can do is ensuring that we continue the tradition of Jim Condo's and elect a fierce advocate for free and fair elections here in Vermont, and make sure that we are franchising as many people as we can in Vermont, and making sure that the culture of voting integrity and transparency sets a standard, not just for Vermont, but for the nation. We have a lot of limits of what we as a small state can do when fighting back against a hostile federal government or a hostile federal judiciary. I think what's imperative is that we have leaders who are committed to doing everything legally possible and feasible to make sure that our nation does not become a failed democracy. That's going to take work and dedication from not just the attorney generals around the country, but the secretaries of state. And ultimately, it boils down to voters making sure that they elect leaders and stand for things, including the fundamental right to vote and access to vote in free and fair elections.
Thank you, Rory. Charity, would you like for me to repeat the question?
Sure.
The U.S. Supreme Court will be hearing the case Moore versus Harper next session. There is concern that this ruling could have broad implications for the 2024 election if the court rules broadly enough that states can set their own laws regarding the selection of presidential electors. What are your thoughts on this, and how could the Attorney General's office coordinate with other Attorney General offices to make a difference if this happens?
I have to agree with Rory on a lot of these points. Unsurprisingly, we're both Democrats, and we are both living here in Vermont, where we have had a great Secretary of State, very helpfully protecting our democracy here in Vermont. And this is, out of step with our values here. It's very disconcerting and disturbing to see things happening out of state that are so out of step with our values. One thing that the Attorney General's office does when that happens is we get involved in multi-state lawsuits and multi-state comment letters and multi-state amicus briefs. That's something that we have done in across the divisions. Really, environmental division is a big one. We saw a lot of activity during the Trump years when there was a lot going on the national level. And what we can do is we leverage Vermont's, smaller voice, and along with all of the other voices across the country who are in like-minded states. And we can sort of have a force multiplier and be a more powerful voice. And we regularly do that in our appellate division. The Solicitor General, the Deputy Solicitor General do great work making sure that we're signing on to these multi-state lawsuits. I think it's really important that the next Attorney General have the perspective of that work and can understand some of the challenges of that work that we've had in the past. One of the examples I want to give folks who are listening, we have joined we've had many opportunities to join different lawsuits, and some of them are protective of our constitutional rights sort of broadly, or human rights broadly. Some of them are environmental rights broadly. Some of them are, really bringing it home, and we have specific consumers who have been impacted, or specific, examples of rights being taken away, here in Vermont. And in both of those cases, we can utilize our multi-state work to further Vermont's values. And it's a really good thing. And I think this is another example where we could be helpful.
Thank you. Thank you, Charity. Okay, for this next question, it's a little bit of a fun one. We're going to start with Rory. There are many points and nuances on the Democratic political spectrum, and we're all Democrats here. Where do you envision that you fall on that spectrum? Are you very progressive, very liberal, a little bit more moderate to the center? And how would you envision yourself, where you envision yourself to be politically influence your actions as Attorney General?
That is a fun question, and it's a tough one to answer because, I think one of the things we can take pride in Vermont is that the Democratic Party definitely has a big tent. We have rural Democrats, we have urban Democrats. I've never really liked or believed or subscribed to this notion that Democrats in Chittenden County are different than ones in Windsor or ones in the Kingdom. At the heart of it, I think that as Vermont Democrats, we come back to some core values, and that's really usually centered around community, the old Yankee values of common sense, and I think really caring and showing respect for one's neighbors. I've never been particularly a big fan of the labels of moderate or progressive, because I think that we have to have the intellectual space and room in the party to tolerate differences of opinion. I think what makes our party great is looking at just how diverse our viewpoints are in the Senate or in the House. Lots of different people come from different communities and get together in Montpelier for the miserable winter and then get out as fast as they can in May. But a lot gets done. And I think when you look back at what our Democratic majorities have been able to achieve despite having a Republican governor, there's a lot to be proud of. And there are votes where there's a veto-proof majority, and there are votes where there are not. Personally, I'll just harken back to what my values are. I care deeply about equity in education finance, equity and opportunity for BIPOC Vermonters, for LGBTQIA Vermonters, for people who are different than me. I understand that as a white male, I have a certain amount of privilege that other people can't have or don't automatically have, including Vermont's women. That perspective informs how I think about problems. I try to put myself in others' shoes, and I try to approach every problem with empathy. And I think part of that process is also assuming that if we just limit ourselves to labels of, well, that's what a progressive Democrat wants, or that's what the moderates want, or that's what the corporatist ones want, or whatever label we want to put out there, it takes away from trying to understand why that person believes what they believe. I think, again, a core value of Democrats is listening to one another and finding pragmatic solutions to move forward. So irrespective of label, I hope to be a Democrat who works well within the caucus in the House and Senate, can work well with the administration where there's common ground, but also can stand up when there are Vermonters being hurt by policies that don't make sense or legal actions that are impacting safety or the vibrancy of our communities. So at the end of the day, I don't like labels, but I just want to be first and foremost a Vermonter.
Thank you, Rory. Charity, now to you. Where do you kind of see yourself on the spectrum of being a Democrat?
I am a Vermont Democrat, which means I assume I know everyone in the state. I'm 1 degree of separation away from everyone. And I have friends who are progressives. I have friends who are Republicans. And I, of course, have friends who are Democrats. And I like to think, I have that broad reach. And when I'm working in the legislature, I have friends across the spectrum as well. I think that it's really important that we maintain that ethos in Vermont and of neighborliness, even if we have differences. That said, I'm very pro small businesses. I'm really an advocate and a champion for small businesses. And of course, I'm a lawyer and I'm wearing a suit. So I feel like I'm more moderate than maybe I am, because I did take a quiz recently and found out that I am among the 3% most progressive viewpoints in the country. So that's probably right in the middle in Vermont, but certainly countrywide, I'm very progressive Democrat.
Thank you, Charity. Okay, this next question, we're going to start with Rory. What specific steps or enforcement actions would you take to ensure that campaign finance is as transparent as possible in Vermont?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was actually just speaking with one of the Secretary of State candidates, and I don't want to steal their thunder when they talk about this, but there's been this discussion and contemplation of, and sort of the running joke has been when there's a campaign finance issue, the Secretary of State points at the Attorney General, and the Attorney General points back at the Secretary of State. So it's a unique setting where we have some real overlap of interest. One thing is right now, I think it's imperative that we have accurate and transparent reporting. The Secretary of State's office has done a fantastic job of making sure that those donor reports are available online to the point where you can count how many individual donors to what dollar amount. It's a lot of data that's put out there, and it can give you some indication of who supports who. I don't want to wade into the troubled waters of the congressional campaigns, but certainly there's a lot going on, a lot of discussion right now about outside money coming into Vermont, whether from PACs or super PACs. Vermont has a difficult path to navigate. I think we want to continue to emphasize that our election should be dominated by local dollars, local viewpoints, and local priorities. That's not so easy to do when we live in a country where we're under the regime of Citizens United, where corporations are given the power of a voter and having voice and being able to speak with their dollars. I think the real concern revolves around transparency, but also making sure that that is available to everyone to understand and process. At the end of the day, some of these super PACs and PAC names don't make sense. They have euphemistic names of Voters for America. What do they stand for? Who are they? Does a basic corporate document actually tell you what they stand for or who they are? So I think we could probably expand what information is out there in terms of corporate donors or other where those dollars are coming from.
Thank you, Rory. Charity, that same question to you. What specific steps or enforcement actions would you take to ensure that campaign finance is as transparent as possible in Vermont?
Well, the Attorney General's office, of course, is the enforcement arm of the campaign finance law. And what triggers an investigation or a look into a campaign finance violation is a complaint. So one way that we could be more transparent is to make complaints public. And I think that I want to stop for a minute and say our campaign finance law. It's really important that we regulate this, that we look at this. I know in different states, everyone has a different approach, and we want to make sure that our approach is right for Vermont and not borrow someone else's approach. I applaud the Secretary of State for being really user-friendly. And if someone has a concern, they can just pick up the phone and call the Secretary of State. That's really, really important. They also have, a great informational packet, so you can just look at that and understand it in a user-friendly way. One thing that we're so proud of in Vermont is we have a citizen legislature, and people are not expected to be lawyers who can, read a statute really easily and crunch the information about campaign finance. So simply, an everyday person should be able to read that. And I think they did a really nice job with that. In terms of specific steps, I think that it would be being, having an easier, more transparent approach to complaints that are made to the Attorney General's office, similarly to how we do make public records requests, for example. That would be one way to be more transparent. In my experience as Chief of Staff of the Attorney General's office these past 4 years, we didn't receive all that many complaints. Certainly, every so often we would get one, but it wasn't like we had an onslaught of complaints. So.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Charity. So this is our last question, question number 10, and Sharon in the YouTube chat asked a similar question. So I'm going to kind of combine the two. So what steps would your office like to take to protect vulnerable citizens of Vermont? And Sharon asked specifically about victims of domestic violence. So this one, we're going to start with you, Charity.
This is an issue that's really important to me. especially as a woman. The majority of victims of domestic violence are women. This is an issue that I'm making kind of a marquee issue of my campaign. Vermont has never elected a woman attorney general, and I feel passionately that we need to focus on this issue. Incredibly, there are 40,000 victims of domestic violence in Vermont every year. 40,000. I don't know why we don't talk about this more. It's really jarring. There are probably people watching this who have been a victim, or are currently a victim of domestic violence. And I want you to know you deserve to be safe. You deserve to feel safe. I see you. Here's what we have at the Attorney General's office. We have, by statute, housed the Domestic Violence Fatality Review Commission. And that commission every year looks back on the previous year and identifies, it does like case studies and data analysis of the fatalities related to domestic violence. I think we need to be amplifying their work. They make recommendations to the legislature and to the governor's office. I want to be a champion of those recommendations. That commission is, all the major stakeholders are there putting their heads together and telling us the way forward. We need to listen and implement. Last year, here's what they recommended, specifically on the top of my head, that we codify in statute the ability for a judge to take away a gun by an abuser, and not just one they own, but one that's in the house where they're living. Okay, they can't be in a house living in a place where there's access to guns. The second issue that's troubling is in some counties, there is no way to for a domestic violence victim to return to the home and get possessions they might need. We need to make that easier and simpler. And we need to make sure that our local agencies have the support that they need to help victims of domestic violence. I could go on about this topic a long time, and I know my time is up, so I'm going to end there, but I can't emphasize enough how important this issue is. Thanks.
Thank you, Charity. Rory, that same question to you.
So this is one area where I think there's a distinction between Charity and I. I've been doing the work for the past 6 years in Vermont's court system. My first role as a chief deputy in the Washington County State's Attorney was being the special victim prosecutor. That meant working every day with survivors of domestic violence, whether they were cooperative or uncooperative in the process. Through that experience, I've learned an awful lot about how we need to approach this, and it's a full systems approach. First and foremost, it's not just about prosecuting or reacting from law enforcement. It's making sure that there are robust partnerships and full-fledged support for advocacy organizations. In Washington County, we're incredibly fortunate to have Circle, for example. Our partnership with Circle and with law enforcement has enabled the deployment of countless resources to our county, including DV investigators who do the follow-up work and do the hard work of working with survivors to make sure that when we do decide, or where there is a prosecution, that we're successful and that we're doing what we can to protect that person going forward. I'd also note domestic violence is no longer just a violence against women issue. Increasingly, we have men who are victims of domestic violence. We have same-sex couples that have domestic violence issues. There is no familiar pattern, and our expectations of who is a victim has to change much as we reflect on the pervasiveness of intimate partner violence in Vermont. One thing I want to say is really important to understand is that right now, Vermont does not have a victim-centered or victim-focused system when it comes to holding offenders accountable. When someone is found guilty of a crime of domestic violence, they may go under the supervision of the Department of Corrections. There may be jail time involved. But no matter what, when there's supervision, it means that there's someone helping them navigate services, sometimes giving them recovery housing or reentry housing. Victims are often left at the end of the process standing alone without a permanent solution. And quite frankly, the economic insecurity, the concerns about pets, the concerns about children, and the concerns about work, transportation, and income are all impediments that prevent victims from coming forward, getting safe, and moving on. The most critical thing we need to do as Vermonters is make sure that we're meeting victims where they are, irrespective of whether they want a prosecution or not. And that starts with quality services for victims.
Thank you very much, Rory. Well, that wraps up the question portion, but I want to give you each 2 minutes as a wrap-up, follow-up. And for that, we'll be starting with Charity. So Charity, go ahead.
Well, thanks again for having us tonight. This has been really fun and just great to be able to tell you my vision for the office. I really believe that we are at a challenging moment in Vermont's history, and we have a lot of issues facing us, from the pandemic to, some of we touched on tonight, domestic violence. Global warming is incredibly important. Toxics in schools is incredibly important. Gun safety, all of these issues require an attorney general who knows how to leverage the office for the best results. We need an attorney general who can meet this moment, who has the experience, the network, and the vision. I want to be the people's lawyer. I want to fight for small businesses. I want to fight for consumers. I want to fight for families. I want to fight for Vermonters. And we deserve an attorney general who has the vision to make that happen. I will be ready to lead on day one. I thank you for hearing me out tonight, and I'm always available. If you have more questions, you can find me at charityforvermont.com. And thanks again for having me.
Thank you. Rory, your 2 minutes.
Well, first of all, thank you very much to the Windsor County Democrats. The questions have been really engaging and complicated, and I appreciate the sort of depth and the areas I've had to really think about answers for. But I think that underscores that we're in an incredibly challenging time. The questions are complicated because the challenges Vermont face are really different than the ones that TJ Donovan faced when he came into office 6 years ago. With that, I think it's time we need fresh perspective. We need fresh eyes and a proactive approach to tackle these challenges, whether it's leadership on criminal justice reform, especially in the realm of law enforcement accountability in this moment, or looking at how we combat our biggest public safety challenges, starting with gun violence and working our way down to figuring out how we can best implement harm reduction strategies while still holding people who traffic or trade in guns accountable. These are tricky issues for a reason. We are a complex state with a lot of complex people. But all of this boils down to having leadership and vision. That leadership and vision needs to be informed by putting people first, by having the experience in and out of the courtroom, in and out of the state house to get results. We can't just sit in study committee and think about problems. We need to make sure that there are decisive leaders in Vermont's offices doing the work of Vermonters and making sure that our exceptionalism as a state isn't just a hollow slogan. What's clear to me and why I'm running for Attorney General is that we need to do more, whether it's ensuring equity in schools, whether it's ensuring that Vermont is a welcoming place for people of color or immigrants to this country. Making sure that Vermont is not just a place where we have pictures of beautiful lakes, but that the water in those lakes is clean, that we are prepared for the climate crisis that's coming. Our challenges are significant, but we can and will achieve them with the right drive, the right leadership, and justice, a system of justice that's rooted in Vermont's values. Thank you.
Thank you, Rory, and thank you, Charity. Thank you to all of those people who joined us on YouTube. I appreciate all of you being here and submitting your questions and chatting in the chat box. A call to public service and running for office definitely takes commitment, and it's not an easy road. So I want to thank our candidates tonight. If you have feedback, please do let us know. And again, if you found this evening's forum helpful and informative, please follow the link in the description below to donate to the Windsor County Democratic Committee. Your donation will help us to ensure that Democrats and those who will uphold, defend, and ensure our values and rights are elected up and down the ballot in November. So stay safe and good night, everyone. Okay, we are